Somewhere near Ascalon, in the late autumn of 1177, a young king rode with hands that were already beginning to fail him. Far ahead, across the open plain, another army moved with the confidence of men who believed the campaign was almost finished. That is where I want to begin. Not with the legend people remember, but with the moment before anyone knew they were riding into one. I'm Steve Turcotte, and when I come back to the story of Baldwin IV and Saladin, I try to set aside the polished images we inherit from paintings, films, and internet mythology. Real history rarely arrives dressed for ceremony. It comes in dust, fatigue, fear, and decisions made before sunset. Baldwin IV was very young in the year 1177, but just saying he was young misses the point. By then, he had already spent years living with leprosy, a disease feared in the medieval world not only as an illness, but as something heavy with spiritual meaning. His tutor, William of Tyre, had noticed the first signs when the boy seemed unable to feel pain the way other children did. In any royal court, that kind of discovery could never remain private for long. The body of a prince was not just his own, it was a matter of the state. And still, Baldwin became king. The kingdom he inherited was never secure. Jerusalem was sacred, yes, but sacred does not mean safe. It was a frontier kingdom, narrow in manpower, exposed on every side, and dependent on strong leadership, quick movement, fortified cities, and the ability to survive between stronger powers. The Latin Christian states in the Levant endured through castles, marriages, truces, merchant orders, and military orders. They also endured because their enemies had often been divided. That division was ending. By the later 1170s, Saladin had done what many rulers before him had failed to do. He had brought Egypt and Syria together under his authority. That mattered more than any single raid or single battle. It meant the kingdom of Jerusalem was no longer facing scattered rivals. It was facing a ruler with resources, political legitimacy, and strategic patience. Saladin was not yet the larger-than-life figure later memory would celebrate, but he was already the most formidable Muslim ruler the Crusader states had faced in that generation. He could negotiate like a statesman and campaign like a commander who understood something timeless about war. Battles are not won by courage alone. They are won by timing, supply, discipline, and by knowing when the enemy has become vulnerable. In 1177, he saw that vulnerability. The kingdom's main forces had been drawn away. Baldwin was in the south. The countryside was exposed. Saladin crossed into the kingdom with a major army, and while medieval chroniclers often exaggerate numbers, the exact total matters less than the reality. He came with a force much larger than anything Baldwin could meet on equal terms. That much is clear. This is the point where stories often become too simple. One side is turned noble, the other arrogant. One ruler becomes saintly, the other blind with pride. But real history is rarely so tidy. Saladin was an able commander, not a fool. Still, even the best commanders are human, and success can teach dangerous habits. Victory creates confidence. Confidence becomes assumption, and assumption is where armies begin to die. As Saladin advanced, villages burned, fields were damaged, civilians fled with what they could carry. In the 12th century, this was not some tragic side effect of war. For the people living through it, this was war itself. Strategy appeared first as smoke on the horizon. Inside that danger stood Baldwin. Some medieval writers describe him almost as a chosen sufferer, a king preserved by divine purpose. But when I read the sources carefully, what I see is something, in some ways, even more compelling. A ruler with very few good options, trying to act before events outran him. That matters. Courage becomes more meaningful when it belongs to a real human being, and not a symbol. Baldwin IV was not just an icon to the people around him. He was a sick, young king whose decisions could save the kingdom or ruin it. He withdrew to Ascalon, one of the crucial strongholds guarding the southern approach. That made sense. Ascalon was a fortress, a gateway, and one of the places from which a defense could still be organized. Saladin did not waste time on a full siege. Instead, he contained him there and pushed forward deeper into the kingdom. That too made sense. If the greater prize lies ahead, why stop for the smaller one? And yet, this is where the question begins to matter.
At what point does prudence turn into overconfidence? Baldwin's weakness was visible to everyone. His youth, his illness, the uncertainty around him, none of that was hidden. Saladin's strength was visible too. The balance of power looked obvious. But history often turns at the exact moment one side stops imagining that the other can still act. Somewhere in those days, while Saladin's army spread across the countryside and the kingdom seemed to bend under the pressure, the shape of the campaign began to change. Not because of magic, not because the heavens opened. It changed because Baldwin refused to remain pinned behind stone walls. And when he chose to move, every man around him had to decide what honor meant. Not the easy kind sung by poets, I mean the harder kind. The kind that asks whether you ride out when every sensible voice says stay where you are. The kind that binds frightened men to a decision they would never choose alone. The roads out of Ascalon were still open enough for action. That fact, small as it may have seemed at the time, mattered more than anyone could yet know. Because the real struggle had not yet begun. The battle people remember was still ahead. What mattered first was the decision to leave safety behind. And when you strip away the legend, that may be the most extraordinary part of all. A teenage king, already marked by a disease the medieval world associated with dread and decay, looked at a stronger enemy, a burning countryside, and a kingdom with too few men to defend it properly. He did not choose shelter, he chose movement. That choice would carry him toward Montgisard, and with it, toward the one moment that would define his name for centuries.
To understand Baldwin's choice, you have to understand the kind of kingdom he was trying to save. Jerusalem was never defended by endless reserves waiting just beyond the next ridge. The Crusader states were smaller, more fragile, and more exposed than their reputation sometimes suggests. Their strength came from castles, ports, mounted elites, and the ability to gather armed men quickly when danger appeared. Their weakness was much simpler. They did not have many men to lose. By the year 1177, Baldwin IV had already shown that he was far more than a ceremonial ruler. He was involved in politics, in appointments, in military decisions, and in the daily work of holding together a frontier kingdom. He also ruled under a shadow that everyone understood, even when they did not say it aloud. His illness meant the future of the dynasty was uncertain. And in the medieval world, uncertainty about succession was poison. Still, Baldwin did not rule alone. Around him stood barons, bishops, household knights, and the great military orders. Some were loyal, some were ambitious. Most, like most people in power, were some mixture of both. That is worth remembering. The Crusader aristocracy was not made of marble. These were not storybook figures frozen in ideals. They argued, maneuvered, protected their families, and sometimes, when the hour demanded it, rose to genuine greatness. Among the most important men around Baldwin were the Templars. Their exact numbers at Montgisard are debated, and I think it is always wise to be careful with medieval figures. But there is no real doubt that the Templars were there, and that their presence mattered. They were feared not because they were mystical, but because they were disciplined, trained, and organized for war in a way few others were. They were not always wise, they were not invincible, but when a crisis came, they could give a small Christian force a hard and dangerous edge. So Baldwin gathered what men he could. This is where popular retellings often flatten the story into a neat line, a few hundred knights against tens of thousands. The image is powerful, but the reality was probably more complicated. Chroniclers liked dramatic numbers, especially when they wanted to show the scale of a victory. We should be careful with exact totals. What matters most is the imbalance. Baldwin's force was very small. Saladin's was much larger. And more importantly, Saladin's army had begun to spread out. That is one of the oldest truths in military history. An army in motion can become vulnerable when it starts to believe the hard part is over. Men range out, units loosen, baggage slows the pace, foraging and looting break cohesion. The enemy no longer feels immediate, and when that happens, even a strong army can become strangely exposed. That was the opening Baldwin moved toward. There is a strong tradition in the Christian sources that the true cross accompanied the army. To a modern audience, that may sound symbolic in a distant or decorative way, but in the 12th century it was not decorative. A relic like that shaped the emotional world of the army. Men did not simply march beside it, they believed it changed what their deaths might mean. It did not remove fear, but it gave fear a form. It placed fear inside a larger story. That, I think, is something we modern readers can miss if we are not careful. Medieval warfare was practical, brutal, and deeply physical, but it was also spiritual in ways that cannot be dismissed without losing the texture of the age. For Baldwin's men, faith and terror marched side by side. As the Crusader force left Ascalon and moved north, nothing about the decision guaranteed success. In fact, the move itself was dangerous. They were leaving the safety of walls and riding into open country against a much larger invading army. If Saladin had discovered them early and met them in proper order, the result might have been disaster. This was not some magical reversal of fate, it was a narrow gamble. And that's what makes it so important. What kind of ruler risks a kingdom like that? I do not think the answer is simply courage. Sometimes war rewards the man who understands that delay is also a choice. Baldwin seems to have grasped something his circumstances forced on him. If he stayed behind walls and waited, the kingdom would continue to burn. Jerusalem itself might fall into direct danger before help could arrive. In other words, caution could lose him everything just as surely as recklessness might. That is the cruel paradox of command. The safer option is not always the safer outcome. Meanwhile, Saladin continued inland with good reason to feel secure. He had entered the kingdom with strength. He had not been decisively opposed. His army was doing what victorious armies often did in hostile territory, feeding itself, looting, and pressing its advantage not just materially, but psychologically. But success carries within it its own danger. It stretches lines, it tires horses, it tempts men into believing the war is already decided. Near Ramla and the region known as Montgisard, those assumptions were about to be tested. The land there mattered. I always think that is worth saying clearly, because battlefields are often remembered as symbols when they were first physical places. Roads mattered, ground mattered, the timing of movement mattered. If you bring heavy cavalry against a disordered enemy at the right moment, legend can later grow from very earthly causes. And still, even if we stay practical, we should not strip the emotion away from it. Imagine the sounds as Baldwin's force approached. Hoofs striking dry ground, harness leather pulling tight, mail shifting over padded cloth, the strange near silence that comes over men when there is no more room for debate. We often inherit two myths about medieval knights. One says they were shining guardians of ideal honor. The other says they were just violent opportunists wrapped in expensive metal. The truth is more uncomfortable, and to me, much more interesting. Knights were instruments of social power trained for violence inside a culture that also demanded piety, public loyalty, and visible courage. They could be devout and ruthless, disciplined and petty, self-serving and brave. All of that rode with them onto the field. At Montgisard, what mattered was that they hit hard and together. The Crusader cavalry charge, supported by whatever infantry and mounted support followed Baldwin, struck an enemy that was not fully ready. Once a line gives way under that kind of attack, fear begins doing work that steel alone cannot do. Medieval armies did not break only because men died. They broke because confidence vanished. Soldiers saw others turn. They heard commands dissolve into dust and noise. They lost the belief that the group still held. And once that certainty is gone, even a great army can feel hollow. There are accounts suggesting that Saladin's own position became dangerously exposed, and that he escaped only with difficulty. Later tradition adds vivid details, some of them dramatic enough that historians treat them carefully. That caution is fair, but even allowing for embellishment, the larger truth remains. He was not withdrawing in calm strength, he was surviving a real defeat. And that matters, because history often smooths the past into straight lines. Saladin later takes Jerusalem, and so people imagine he must have always seemed unstoppable.
Baldwin dies young, and so people imagine him only as tragic. But for one brief and astonishing moment at Montgisard, those expectations reversed. The sick king struck successfully. The stronger ruler was driven back. Still, no single battle tells the whole story. The air after combat would have been thick with the smell of sweat, torn earth, blood, and the smoke of a countryside already damaged by war. Men would not have looked heroic. They would have looked stunned, their hearing dulled, their throats raw with dust, their hands shaking from what they had just done. This is one of the things war does that memory often softens. It empties human beings at the exact moment later generations call them glorious. If Baldwin's men felt triumph that day, I suspect it was mixed with disbelief, because what they had really won at Montgisard was not safety, it was time. And time, in history, is often the rarest victory of all. The tragedy, as we will see, is that time can be wasted.
Saladin did not become dangerous by being careless. That is important to remember. He was dangerous because he could combine war with politics and politics with legitimacy. He understood that the struggle against the Crusader states was not only about land, it was also about authority, reputation, and religious leadership. Every campaign tested his standing among allies, rivals, and subjects. Every victory strengthened his claim to lead. So when he entered the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the year 1177, he was not simply riding in to burn and plunder at random. He was applying pressure in a deliberate way. He knew the kingdom was vulnerable. He knew Baldwin was young and seriously ill. He knew that a successful invasion would weaken Christian morale and strengthen his own position. What he may not have fully expected was how vulnerable his own army could become once it spread too far across hostile country. The sources from the time, as usual, do not all tell the story in the same voice. Christian chroniclers often describe Saladin's army as swollen with confidence, almost inviting divine punishment. Muslim chroniclers tend to frame the disaster differently, emphasizing confusion, reversal, and the changing fortune of war rather than moral failure. Somewhere between those voices, a probable picture emerges. Saladin's army had stretched itself during operations in the field, and parts of it were less prepared for a concentrated attack than they should have been. That is not stupidity. It is one of the oldest risks in campaigning. What fascinates me about medieval war is how often victory depends not just on strength, but on human rhythm. Men grow tired, horses wear down, discipline loosens, water matters, weather matters, confidence matters. An army that looks unstoppable in the morning can become oddly fragile by afternoon if its units stop feeling like one body. Baldwin moved directly into that opening. There is a strong tradition that before the battle, Baldwin prayed before the true cross. Whether every later detail attached to that moment is exact is hard to say, but even if parts of the story were sharpened by retelling, the image still tells us something true about how people of the time understood what was happening. Baldwin's kingship was not simply political in their eyes, it was sacred. He was not defending just a territory, he was defending the kingdom that held Jerusalem. That sharpened everything. And yet, there was nothing abstract about the danger in front of him. Saladin's army was large, mixed, and fully capable of absorbing a frontal assault if given time to organize. Baldwin's only real chance was speed, shock, concentration. He had to strike before the army in front of him could recover its shape. That is one reason Montgisard matters beyond its drama. It shows how quality and timing can, for a moment, defeat quantity. Not forever, not magically, but decisively enough to change a campaign. I think we often misunderstand medieval knights because we inherit two competing myths. One treats them like shining guardians of honor. The other treats them like little more than brutal opportunists in polished armor. The truth is less convenient and more human. Knights were products of a society that trained them for violence, while also expecting displays of piety, loyalty, and courage. They could be devout and cruel, disciplined and self-interested, noble in one hour and petty in the next. At Montgisard, what mattered most was not what later poetry would make of them, it was that they hit hard and together.
When the Christian cavalry charge landed, it struck an enemy that had not fully formed itself for battle. And once that kind of charge breaks into an army that is not ready, fear begins doing work that steel alone cannot. Medieval armies did not collapse only because bodies fell. They collapsed because confidence broke. Men looked to the side and saw others turning away. They heard commands disappear into dust and shouting. They felt the structure around them dissolving. And once that happens, even a strong army can suddenly feel empty. There are traditions that Saladin's own position became badly exposed and that he escaped only with difficulty. Later stories add vivid details, including his retreat on a camel after losing much of his army's cohesion and baggage. Historians treat the more dramatic details carefully, and that caution is fair, but the larger truth holds. He was not directing a calm and orderly withdrawal from strength. He was surviving a defeat. And that should make us stop for a moment. History often smooths itself into straight lines after the fact. Saladin later recaptures Jerusalem, so people assume he must have always seemed unstoppable. Baldwin dies young, so people imagine him only as tragic. But at Montgisard, the pattern broke. For one astonishing afternoon, the sick king drove back the stronger ruler. Still, no single battle explains a whole era. The air after the fighting must have been thick with sweat, churned earth, blood, and smoke from a countryside already scarred by war. The men who survived would not have looked like the clean heroes of later paintings. They would have looked dazed, their hands shaking, their throats burned raw with dust, their hearing still dulled by impact and screaming. This is one of the things war does that later memory almost always softens. It drains people at the exact moment others decide to call them glorious. If Baldwin's men felt triumph, I imagine disbelief was mixed into it. Because what they achieved at Montgisard was not simply survival. They had interrupted the political momentum of Saladin himself. They had struck not just at an army, but at the reputation of the ruler leading it. For the kingdom of Jerusalem, that mattered far beyond the field. But hidden inside the victory was a cruel truth. Baldwin had not solved the kingdom's problems. He had bought time. And time in history is one of the rarest victories of all. Yet time is also something kingdoms waste as often as they use. That is the deep sadness already beginning to gather around this story. Montgisard was real, the shock was real, the courage was real. But even the most extraordinary battlefield success by itself cannot repair a weak political structure, secure a succession, or guarantee wise leadership after the victor is gone. So, if we want to understand Baldwin honestly, we have to resist turning him into a miracle that floats above history. He was not a miracle outside history. He was a ruler inside it, acting at exactly the right moment with exactly the right force against an enemy caught in exactly the wrong posture. That does not make the achievement smaller. If anything, it makes it greater. Because now the victory belongs not to legend alone, but to judgment, nerve, timing, and the willingness of a dying king to gamble what remained of his life on one violent decision. And that is where the story becomes more tragic, not less. Because the man who won that day did not win himself a future. He won the kingdom a little more time.
News of the victory spread quickly. In the medieval world, that mattered almost as much as the battle itself. A great victory did not just end with bodies on a field. It traveled through letters, rumors, sermons, courts, and memory. Montgisard became proof that the kingdom of Jerusalem could still resist. It gave relief to frightened people, confidence to allies, and perhaps, in time, a dangerous kind of hope. Victories always have political uses. They reassure, they silence critics, they make weakness look temporary. But for Baldwin, no triumph could erase the truth of his illness. This is where I find the story most difficult and in some ways most moving. The king, who had just led one of the most remarkable battlefield reversals of the age, did not return from Montgisard into renewed life. He returned to the same body, and that body was still failing him. Leprosy in the medieval world was feared for many reasons, not all of them medically accurate by modern standards. People understood it through scripture, ritual, fear, and social distance. But Baldwin's case forces us to look at both the medieval meaning and the physical reality. He was not a symbol floating above his condition. He was a ruler with a degenerative disease, trying to govern a militarized frontier kingdom. Every year made rule harder. Every year made succession more urgent. And that is one reason I try not to turn Baldwin into a simple inspirational figure. He was admirable, yes, but he was also trapped inside a dynastic problem that courage alone could not solve. He could defeat an army. He could not easily guarantee what would happen after his death. Saladin, meanwhile, did not disappear into humiliation after Montgisard. He learned from it. I think that tells us a great deal about him. A lesser ruler might have become reckless or broken or obsessed with immediate revenge. Saladin did something more dangerous. He rebuilt. He adjusted. He continued the larger political project that had already made him formidable. This is why the pairing of Baldwin and Saladin matters so much. They are often cast as opposites in the simplest possible way. One sick, one strong, one fading, one rising. But there is another symmetry between them. Both understood that war was tied to legitimacy. Both ruled under immense pressure. Both knew that surviving was not enough. A ruler had to be seen surviving. In the years after 1177, Baldwin remained active in government and in military affairs, despite worsening health. That alone is extraordinary. He was not pushed aside into ceremonial irrelevance. He continued dealing with nobles, alliances, threats, and the constant tension of succession. The kingdom under him was not at peace, but it remained functioning longer than many might have expected. Still, the strain inside the ruling elite deepened. This is where romantic crusader history often fails us. Courts do not become noble simply because danger surrounds them. Sometimes danger sharpens ambition instead of suppressing it. Men think about marriages, they calculate inheritance, they gather supporters, they place themselves closer to future power. In Jerusalem, the question of who would rule after Baldwin became more urgent every year, because everyone understood the same thing. His life would likely be short, and he would not leave a secure line of heirs. People speak of honor as though it were simple, but in a court, honor is often divided. There is loyalty to the king, loyalty to the kingdom, loyalty to family, loyalty to one's own future. These things do not always point in the same direction. A man can tell himself he is defending principle when he is really defending his place. That tension haunted Baldwin's reign. Among the men who would later matter most was Guy of Lusignan. His rise remains one of the most consequential developments in the kingdom's final years. Through marriage into the royal family, he moved close to the center of power. Later chroniclers make him look almost like the embodiment of failure. Historians today tend to be more careful than that, and rightly so. He may have been weaker than the role demanded. He may also have been a man overwhelmed by circumstances and by a court already divided against itself. But whatever balance we strike, one thing is clear. Baldwin eventually lost confidence in him. Then there was Reynaud of Chatillon, a man whose name comes to us with a hard edge for good reason. He was experienced, daring, and dangerous. He had the kind of frontier boldness that can look impressive right until it becomes catastrophic. If Baldwin represented discipline under suffering, Reynaud represented another possibility altogether, the temptation to turn border war into personal theater. And men like that can destroy states. Saladin was watching all of this. A ruler does not need to sit in your council chamber to know that your kingdom is weakening. Delay sends signals. Broken truces send signals. Faction, hesitation, and inconsistency all send signals. Saladin did not need to defeat Baldwin at his strongest if time itself was weakening the kingdom from within. That, to me, is one of the saddest truths in medieval history. A kingdom can hold against external pressure for years and still be undone by internal uncertainty. Steel at the frontier is obvious. A succession crisis begins more quietly. It starts in corridors, in marriage plans, in careful arguments spoken around candles. It begins in rooms where no blood is shed at all. By the early 1180s, Baldwin's body had deteriorated more severely. The evidence suggests increasing disability, and later in his life, loss of sight. Yet he still appeared in affairs of state and war with a determination that impressed even those who may not have loved him personally. And Saladin still had not taken Jerusalem. That matters.
It reminds us that Baldwin's reign was not just a long decline toward inevitable disaster, it was an active defense of a vulnerable kingdom under conditions that would have broken many healthier men. Even while losing control of his own body, he delayed the collapse of the state. But delay is not rescue. The candles in Jerusalem's halls kept burning over arguments that would outlive him. Outside, the walls still stood, the churches still rang their bells, the roads still carried pilgrims, soldiers, merchants, and fear. Everything looked as though it might continue, and yet the future had already begun to move in another direction. I think Baldwin sensed that before many others were willing to admit it. A king in his condition would have known, perhaps more sharply than anyone around him, that time had become the kingdom's most precious resource. He had won some of it at Montgisard. He had held on to more of it through force of will and political effort, but he could not manufacture it forever. That is what makes this part of the story so tragic. Baldwin was still holding the line. Saladin was still being kept at bay. Jerusalem was still standing. But beneath that surface, the question that would decide everything was already growing louder. Who comes after him? And once that question becomes the center of political life, even a victory as great as Montgisard begins to look less like salvation and more like a reprieve.
By the year 1183, Baldwin's condition had worsened so much that even the basic fact of his kingship had become a problem for the kingdom. Not because anyone could deny that he was the rightful ruler, but because the daily business of command, movement, war, and public authority depended on a body that was beginning to fail in plain view. This is the point in a lesser story where a figure like Baldwin would fade into the background, becoming almost symbolic while stronger men stepped forward. But the record suggests something much more remarkable. He remained politically alert. He understood the danger around him, and with the tools he still had, however limited, he tried to shape what would come after him. That same year, Saladin launched another major campaign. The details of every movement in those years can get complicated, and the sources do not always line up neatly, but the broader picture is clear enough. Baldwin, though gravely ill, still mattered enough that his presence could change events. There is a famous tradition that when the Christian army moved, Baldwin was carried on a litter because he could no longer ride properly. Most historians accept some version of that image, even if the exact details remain hard to pin down. Whether he was fully born like a helpless invalid or moved with some support and ceremony, the larger truth stands. The king, whose body was collapsing, still made himself present with the army. I find that image less romantic than sobering. A king on a litter is not some charming medieval flourish. It is an image of political necessity colliding with human weakness. It forces a question that rulers across history have had to face in different ways. How much of kingship is action, and how much is presence? If an army stands firmer because the king is there, then even a dying ruler becomes a military instrument. That is not glory in the easy sense. It is burden. Saladin understood burden too, though his was of another kind. He was not only leading armies, he was leading expectations. Every campaign tested his authority. He had allies to reassure, rivals to watch, and the constant need to keep political momentum on his side. He had achieved much, but he still had not taken the prize that carried the greatest sacred meaning. Jerusalem remained outside his grasp. That fact gave Baldwin's continued resistance tremendous weight. And still, inside the kingdom, unity remained thin. Baldwin's attempts to control the succession drew him through a maze of regencies, appointments, and political reversals. At one point, he had his young nephew crowned during his own lifetime. That decision is deeply revealing. It was practical, but it was also desperate. He was trying to force continuity into existence before death turned uncertainty into chaos. The fact that he felt compelled to do that tells you everything. This is one of the places where the word honor becomes difficult. People like to imagine noblemen gathered around a suffering king, setting aside vanity and ambition for the good of the realm. Sometimes that happened, but often it did not. Ambition does not disappear because a kingdom is in danger. If anything, danger can make ambition more urgent.
The court of Jerusalem in Baldwin's final years was not a sanctuary of loyalty. It was a place where policy, inheritance, fear, and opportunity collided every day. Guy of Lusignan rose, fell, and rose again in influence. Raymond of Tripoli remained central, experienced, and controversial. Baldwin's mother, Agnes of Courtenay, also lingered in the background of political memory, though medieval chroniclers often turned women into convenient symbols of intrigue, and modern historians are much more careful about that. As always, the sources are not free from bias. While the nobles maneuvered, ordinary people lived under uncertainty. Garrison towns watched the roads, merchants measured risk, farmers feared the next raid. Pilgrims still arrived because Jerusalem was still Jerusalem, but the kingdom they entered was being held together by increasingly strained leadership. And still, Baldwin endured. I think there's a danger in admiring him too easily. Admiration can flatten a person into a lesson. Baldwin was not a lesson. He was a ruler trying to manage a nearly impossible inheritance with intelligence, courage, and limits he could not escape. Part of what makes him great is that he couldn't fix everything. That is what makes him real. By now, Saladin was no longer just a rising power. He was the central Muslim ruler of the Eastern Mediterranean world. His setbacks had not broken him. If anything, they had taught him patience. He had learned to exploit division, to avoid repeating earlier mistakes, and to wait until the kingdom's strongest defender was gone. The smell of war never left that frontier. Even in quieter times, castles, roads, and camps carried it. Smoke from cook fires mixed with leather, horse sweat, wet wool, lamp oil, and the sour closeness of men who had lived too long in armor. Underneath the formal language of charters and seals, this was the real world in which the kingdom survived. And Baldwin knew better than anyone that survival was not enough if it did not outlast him. That was becoming less likely with every passing year. He could still inspire, he could still rule, he could still appear, still compel, still delay. But delay is not permanence. The army might still fight harder because his presence was near. Saladin might still think twice because his name carried weight. But names don't live forever, and states built too heavily around a single will become frighteningly exposed when that will begins to fade. What strikes me most in this phase of the story is not simply that Baldwin kept going, it's that he kept going while knowing exactly what he could not ultimately control. He could not make himself healthy. He could not create a perfect successor out of a divided court. He could not erase the ambitions of men like Guy or Reynold. He could not guarantee that the time he had bought would be used wisely. And yet, he kept working. There is something almost unbearable in that. To hold power while feeling your grip weaken day by day. To understand the stakes more clearly than the men around you. To know that your body is becoming less useful just as your kingdom needs you most. That is not the stuff of fairy tales. That is the stuff of tragedy. By the middle of the decade, Saladin was stronger than ever. The kingdom was still alive, but increasingly brittle. Baldwin had become the kind of ruler whose greatness could now be measured not just by what he won, but by what had not yet collapsed while he was still breathing. And that's a strange, painful measure of success. He was no longer simply defending a kingdom. He was defending time itself.
When Baldwin IV died in 1185, he was only about 24 years old. That fact always lands with unusual force. There had already been so much war, so much pain, so much political strain packed into such a short life, and yet he died at an age when many men around him were only beginning to establish themselves. His death did not create the kingdom's problems, but it removed the one figure who had consistently held those problems together without letting them become fatal. The crown passed to the child Baldwin V, just as earlier arrangements had tried to ensure. But a child king is never a solution. A child king is a pause, and in a fragile state, pauses are dangerous. Baldwin V himself died in 1186, and with that, the succession question reopened in full. The claims surrounding Sibylla and Guy of Lusignan now moved to the center of events, and from that moment on, the the kingdom entered a more reckless phase of its history. This transition matters because it reveals Baldwin's achievement in a very harsh way. His greatness is measured not only by what he won in battle, but by the disaster he managed to postpone. Once he was gone, the things he had restrained, balanced, or contained no longer held together. Sibylla became queen, and Guy was crowned with her. To some, that looked like continuity. To others, it looked like ruin. Raymond of Tripoli resisted. Faction deepened. Trust shrank. Even before the decisive campaign returned, the kingdom had already begun injuring itself. And Saladin was watching. There is a cold truth in politics that comes through very clearly here. A patient enemy often gains more from your divisions than from his own aggression. Saladin did not need to storm every fortress immediately. He needed his enemies to become proud, divided, and predictable. He needed them to make bad choices at the exact moment when those choices would matter most. Reynald of Chatillon helped bring that moment closer. His attacks on caravans and his contempt for truce arrangements pushed the region closer to total war. Now, we should be careful not to imagine that the frontier had ever been peaceful in a modern sense. Raiding, retaliation, and disputed obligations were always part of this world. But even allowing for that, Reynald's behavior is widely recognized as a severe provocation at precisely the wrong time. He treated strategic restraint as weakness, and men like that often appear bold right up until the moment everyone else has to pay for their boldness. By now, Saladin had reasons that went beyond revenge. Jerusalem still carried enormous religious and political meaning. The failure of the Crusader kingdom was no longer a possibility in the distance. It was becoming something he could shape with deliberate pressure. He had command experience, prestige, resources, and most importantly, an opponent very different from Baldwin. This is where the contrast becomes painful. I do not think Guy of Lusignan was necessarily the complete fool later memory sometimes makes him into. Medieval chroniclers loved simple moral stories, especially after catastrophe. But even if we allow Guy more complexity than the old narratives do, the plain truth remains. Under his leadership, the kingdom made disastrous decisions. Whether those decisions came from weakness, hesitation, bad counsel, or the inability to control ambitious men around him, the outcome was devastating. And this is where Baldwin's memory becomes almost haunting. The kingdom now had leaders with healthier bodies, but weaker judgment. More men capable of writing, but less clarity about when and how to use them. Health, history reminds us, is not the same as strength. What is a knight without discipline? What is a king without self-command? Those are not abstract questions in this story. They decide whether an army drinks from a spring or dies on the road. By the year 1187, Saladin was ready to force the issue. His operations around Tiberias drew the Crusader host into one of the most consequential decisions in the history of the Latin East. A city was threatened. The pressure to act was intense. And within the Christian camp, there was argument. Some urged caution. Some urged immediate movement. Raymond of Tripoli reportedly advised restraint. Others pushed for action. Action won. And this is where the memory of Baldwin matters more than ever because the contrast is so sharp. At Montgisard, Baldwin moved quickly and struck an enemy that had grown disordered. In 1187, Guy moved slowly into conditions that Saladin have shaped to destroy him. Same frontier, same enemy, different judgment. The result would be the opposite of Montgisard in almost every way. The Crusader army marched away from secure water and into the summer heat. That detail cannot be understated. In this landscape, water was not a convenience, it was survival. To leave it behind under those conditions was to begin fighting the battle before the battle had even begun. As the army moved inland, Saladin's mounted forces shadowed it. They harassed it. They controlled the rhythm of the march. They denied relief. They made the Crusader host spend itself on thirst, confusion, and fatigue long before the decisive clash arrived. This is one of the hardest lessons in military history. Armies are not always destroyed by a dramatic blow. Sometimes they are ruined first by bad timing, bad ground, and decisions that feel honorable in the moment, but become fatal in retrospect.
Men can march with banners, relics, and real faith, and still walk into disaster. That is what the kingdom was now doing. By the time the Crusaders reached the area near the Horns of Hattin, they were already suffering badly. The heat was severe, the water was gone or out of reach. Saladin's men controlled the situation. And then came one of the most effective and terrible details of the campaign: fire and smoke. Brush was set alight, smoke rolled towards the Christians, the air thickened, men and horses weakened further. The host was no longer a fighting machine. It was becoming a mass of exhausted bodies trapped in a landscape the enemy had mastered. This was the exact inverse of Montgisard. There, Baldwin used speed, shock, and timing against a dispersed enemy. Here, Saladin used patience, control, and environment against the committed but increasingly broken one. What had once been done to him, he now returned to the kingdom that outlived its strongest king. And even here, the sacred symbols remained. The true cross was with the Crusader army. The same relic that had lifted morale in earlier years was now carried into catastrophe. That doesn't make faith foolish, it makes history painful. Sacred conviction cannot create water. It cannot repair command failure. It cannot override bad strategy. When battle finally came, the Crusaders were exhausted, compressed, and in no condition to escape or break the encirclement. Some fought with extraordinary courage, but courage by itself could no longer change the outcome. The result was total defeat. Guy of Lusignan was captured. The true cross was taken. Reynald of Chatillon was captured and later killed. Templars and Hospitallers faced a grim fate. The kingdom's military strength was shattered in a single campaign. And that is where Baldwin's life comes back into focus one last time. For years, he had held this kingdom together through judgment, force of will, and the kind of authority that made men obey even when they feared the future. Once that authority vanished, the structure cracked with astonishing speed. Saladin, the man who had once been thrown into confusion at Montgisard, now stood at the height of his power. But even now, it's worth resisting the temptation to turn him into a smooth and flawless conqueror. He was capable of mercy in some moments, and severity in others. He understood image, he understood policy, he understood what kind of victory would echo through memory. But he was still a ruler at war, and war always leaves a trail that later admiration tries to tidy up. After Hattin, much of the kingdom lay open. The field army was gone. The roads to Jerusalem were no longer protected by the kind of leadership Baldwin once embodied. Castles still stood, cities remained, but the one thing needed to answer danger in the field had been broken. That is often how kingdoms are lost. Not all at once, not in one clean collapse everywhere, but in the destruction of the force that can still respond. Once that is gone, walls begin to count down their own future. And in all of this, one absence must have been impossible to ignore. Baldwin was gone. The king whose body had been the weakest had, in the end, been one of the strongest things the kingdom possessed.
The campaign that led to Hattin in the summer of 1187 is one of the clearest examples in medieval history of how an army can be defeated before the main clash is even fully joined. Saladin did not simply crush the Crusaders with numbers, he shaped the conditions in which they would weaken themselves. Tiberias became the bait. The city mattered politically, emotionally, and strategically. Raymond of Tripoli's wife was there, which gave the crisis a deeply personal dimension as well. Saladin's operations around the city forced the Crusader leadership into a hard decision. They could stay near reliable water and compel Saladin to come to them under less favorable conditions, or they could march inland across dry country in the heat of summer to relieve the city. They chose to march. I try not to sneer at decisions like that from the comfort of centuries later. In the moment, these men were under immense pressure. A Christian city was under threat. Honor, fear, politics, and incomplete information all pressed on them at once. But leadership is measured in precisely such moments, and at Hattin, leadership failed. The Crusader host left the safety of water and moved into terrain that favored Saladin. His mounted forces shadowed them, harassed them, cut them off, and controlled the rhythm of the campaign. By the time the battle fully arrived, the army was already exhausted and breaking down. This was the complete opposite of Montgisard. At Montgisard, Baldwin had acted quickly against an enemy whose cohesion had loosened. At Hattin, Saladin patiently wore down a force that had marched itself into disaster. One king had once struck at the right moment, the other, years later, moved at the wrong one. And then the symbols returned in the most painful way possible. The true cross was with the Crusader army. The same relic that had once strengthened men at Montgisard now accompanied them into catastrophe. That does not make faith foolish, it makes history harder to bear. Holy objects do not override bad judgment. They cannot conjure water from dry rock. They cannot repair a campaign once the wrong decision has already been made. By the time the fighting centered around the horns of Hattin, the Crusaders were exhausted, thirsty, and trapped in smoke and heat. Saladin's forces used fire, missiles, movement, and encirclement with brutal effect. The Christian charges lacked the weight and cohesion needed to break free. Some men fought with extraordinary courage, but courage alone could no longer change the outcome. The result was ruinous. Guy of Lusignan was captured, the true cross was taken. Raynald of Chatillon was brought before Saladin and killed. Many Templars and Hospitallers were taken and later executed. The military strength of the kingdom was shattered in one campaign. And this is where Baldwin's memory becomes almost unbearable. For years he had held together a kingdom that had no room for major mistakes. He had ruled while sick, while nearly blind, while surrounded by ambitious nobles, and still he had delayed collapse. Once he was gone, the fragile balance disappeared. Men with stronger bodies but poorer judgment inherited the consequences. That is one of history's bitter jokes. Health is not always strength. Sometimes the man who appears weakest is the one keeping the whole structure upright. Saladin, unlike the commander who had fled at Montgisard, now stood at the height of his power. Still, even here we should not flatten him into a perfect hero of memory. Saladin could be measured and merciful in some settings, severe in others. He was pious, politically intelligent, and very conscious of image. His later treatment of Jerusalem would contribute greatly to his reputation, especially when compared to the massacre that had followed the Crusaders' conquest of the city in 1099. But reputation has a way of polishing men. Saladin remained a ruler in war, and war is never clean. After Hattin, much of the kingdom was simply open. The roads to Jerusalem no longer had a field army protecting them. Castles still stood, cities remained, but the force that could respond to major danger had been destroyed. That is what losing a kingdom often looks like in practice. Not every wall falling at once, but the removal of the one thing that can still answer the enemy outside the walls. I imagine the days after Hattin to be full of smoke, rumor, dust, and dread. Wounded men limping back towards the city, refugees dragging what they could save, priests trying to interpret disaster, nobles calculating surrender, resistance, ransom, or flight. In all of it, one absence would have been painfully obvious. Baldwin was gone. The king whose body had once been thought too weak to rule had turned out to be one of the strongest elements in the kingdom's survival. Without him, Jerusalem now faced Saladin with almost none of the clarity, discipline, and grim resolve that had once made the kingdom dangerous. And that matters because it reminds us that political collapse is not always about armies alone. It is also about the disappearance of the people who know how to use them. When Saladin moved against Jerusalem later that year, he was not facing the same kingdom that had once struck him at Montgisard. He was facing a wounded remnant, spiritually shaken, politically divided, and militarily crippled. There was no miracle rising over the horizon now. That is one of the most haunting parts of this story. At Montgisard, the impossible had happened because a dying king accepted risk and moved. At Hattin, disaster came because men who should have known better marched into a trap laid for them in heat and smoke. Same land, same enemy, different leadership. That difference changed everything. The medieval world would remember Hattin as a catastrophe, and rightly so. It was not merely a lost battle, it was the breaking of a system.
The capture of the true cross alone was a blow so severe that many Christians must have felt the world itself had shifted beneath them. And, in some ways, it had. Because after Hattin, the question was no longer whether the kingdom of Jerusalem could dominate the field. That question had been answered. The real question now was whether Jerusalem itself could survive what was coming next. And the answer to that, as we know, would soon arrive at the city's gates.
Jerusalem, in the autumn of 1187, was still the center of the kingdom's meaning, but it was no longer the center of its strength. After Hattin, those two things had been torn apart. The city remained holy, symbolic, and emotionally central to the Latin Christian world, but the army that once gave that meaning military protection had been destroyed. And that is always a dangerous condition for any state. Saladin moved through a landscape that had suddenly lost the ability to answer him in the field. Towns and strongholds fell in sequence. Some resisted briefly, some negotiated, some surrendered because there was no realistic alternative. By the time Saladin came before Jerusalem, the city was crowded not only with its own people, but with refugees, fear, and memory. The defense would be led not by a king, but by Baldwin of Ibelin. Baldwin has been heavily dramatized in modern culture, often in ways that have very little to do with the sources. The real man does not need those inventions. He was already important enough. He was a capable noble under enormous pressure, trying to organize the defense of a city that had become the last great symbol of a kingdom that was no longer really whole. Jerusalem was not in a position to hold out forever. Saladin began the siege in September, and this is one of those moments where modern memory tends to jump too quickly. We imagine siege, then surrender, as if the space between them were empty. In reality, siege warfare was a long strain of impact, waiting, engineering, fear, and negotiation. There was the sound of engines, the crack of stone under pressure, dust in the air, the exhaustion of defenders standing where they knew the breach might come, and always, behind the violence, the possibility of terms. That matters because medieval war was not only destruction, it was also pressure applied until the other side understood what it could no longer save. This is the moment when Saladin's later reputation took one of its most enduring shapes. When Jerusalem surrendered in October, he did not repeat the massacre associated with the Crusaders' capture of the city nearly 90 years earlier. Instead, ransom arrangements were made. Many people were allowed to leave if they could pay. Some were freed through negotiation or charity. Some, however, could not pay and were enslaved. So we should be careful here. The picture was not one of pure mercy. It was more complicated than that. But compared to the memory of the bloodshed of 1099, Saladin's conduct was widely seen as restrained, politically intelligent, and, in many eyes, honorable. His victory was enormous. Jerusalem had returned to Muslim rule. For the Islamic world, this was a moment of profound fulfillment. For Latin Christendom, it was a shock strong enough to shake all of Europe. Bells would ring, preachers would call for response, the Third Crusade would follow. And yet, even at this moment of Saladin's greatest triumph, Baldwin's absence remained impossible to ignore. I do not say that romantically, I mean it as a matter of contrast. By 1187, everyone could see how much had changed since the reign of the Leper King. Under Baldwin, Jerusalem endured despite terrible weakness. After Baldwin, the same kingdom, still rich in titles, castles, and sacred meaning, could no longer preserve what mattered most. Sometimes the death of one ruler reveals how much of a state had been living inside his judgment. That is a hard thing to admit because we prefer to believe institutions are stronger than individuals. In many cases they are, or at least they should be. But frontier kingdoms built on narrow margins can become dangerously dependent on exceptional people. Baldwin had been one of those people. And Saladin knew it. He had faced the kingdom under different men. He understood the difference between enemies who were dangerous because of numbers and enemies who were dangerous because of nerve. Baldwin possessed that second quality in abundance. Guy did not. Whatever Saladin felt in 1187, satisfaction, vindication, solemn purpose, he surely knew he was not now overcoming the same leadership that had bloodied him a decade earlier.
When I think about Jerusalem changing hands that year, I do not first think of banners going up and banners coming down. I think about footsteps, the small human sounds that tell you a world is ending. People carrying what remained of their lives, sandals on stone, hooves in narrow streets, wagon wheels dragging over pavement, the murmur of prayer in different languages, the smell of lamp oil, dust, fear, and animals under the autumn sky. That is how great political change is usually experienced, in details. Saladin entered history's brightest light in those days. Baldwin had already entered its silence. But silence can mislead us. A man may die young and still remain present in every comparison that follows. Baldwin did. In effect, he became the measure by which the kingdom's final leadership was judged, and almost all of it looked weaker beside him. Jerusalem was lost. The story, of course, did not end there. The Third Crusade would come. Richard the Lionheart would arrive. More battles, more negotiations, more legends would follow. But one era had ended. And when an era ends, memory begins choosing what it can bear to keep. That is one reason I think Baldwin was almost pushed toward legend later. People either forget a man like that, or they simplify him. They give him the mask, the speeches, the noble suffering, the impossible aura. But the real Baldwin is stronger than the myth. He was not great because he was flawless. He was great because he ruled while his body betrayed him, in a court full of ambition, in a kingdom with almost no margin for failure, and he still managed to hold it together years longer than anyone had reason to expect. Saladin, too, deserves the same honesty. He was not simply the enemy in Baldwin's story. He was one of the most capable rulers of his age, a man of conviction, patience, and political vision. His victory over Jerusalem was not just the result of Crusader weakness, it was also the result of long effort, strategic discipline, and the ability to recover from humiliation and return stronger. If we deny him that, we reduce Baldwin's achievement too. A great victory only becomes greater when the enemy defeated is truly formidable. That is why this story still matters. It does not give us easy heroes and villains. It gives us two rulers shaped by very different burdens, meeting across a world where faith, power, suffering, and war were bound tightly together. One won the most astonishing battle. One won the city. One delayed disaster through will. The other completed a political and religious project through patience and force. And in the middle of it all stood Jerusalem, more than a city, less than a miracle, and always, always a place where human beings had to live with the consequences of sacred ambitions. By the time the gates opened to Saladin, the age of Baldwin had fully passed, but the memory of the Leper King did not pass with it, not really. It remained in the contrast, in the question that lingered over everything that followed. What if he had lived longer? History never answers that question. It only leaves us with the city, the siege, the surrender, and the shadow of the king who had once kept all of it standing.
The memory of Baldwin IV survived in pieces before it survived in legend. Chroniclers wrote about him with grief, politics, theology, and personal loyalties all mixed together. Some emphasized his suffering, some focused on his piety, some remembered his courage in war. None of them, of course, could know how later centuries would reshape him. Saladin had a different kind of afterlife. He benefited from victory, from political success, and from longevity. He lived long enough after his greatest triumphs for his image to settle into something broad and coherent. Over time, he became not just a victorious ruler, but a model of the chivalrous conqueror, especially in later memory. There is truth in that image, but there is also selection. History tends to smooth men who win. Baldwin did not have that luxury. He died young. His kingdom fell soon afterward. The cause he defended did not prevail in the long run. And when a ruler dies young and loses in the larger arc of events, memory often lets him slip away, unless later generations decide to bring him back. When they did bring Baldwin back, they often did so through fantasy. They gave him masks, speeches, perfect nobility, and a kind of tragic purity that makes him less human than he really was. I think the real Baldwin is stronger than the legend. He was not admirable because he was flawless. He was admirable because he ruled under conditions that would have broken many healthier men. He governed through pain, through faction, through military danger, and through the knowledge that his body would never recover. He certainly made mistakes, every ruler does, but what survives in the sources is not a saint floating above history. It is a king trying to hold a state together while his own body slowly betrayed him. Saladin deserves the same honesty. He was not simply the villain in Baldwin's story. He was one of the most capable rulers of his age, a man of discipline, political intelligence, and serious ambition. His victory over Jerusalem was not only the result of Crusader weakness, it was also the result of long effort, strategic patience, and the ability to recover from setbacks like Montgisard. If we deny him that, we make Baldwin's achievement smaller too. Great victories require formidable opponents. This is one reason I am careful with the language of miracle. Medieval writers naturally saw divine meaning in these events, and we should respect that as part of how they understood the world. But if we use the word too casually today, we risk losing the real human conditions that made those moments possible. Montgisard was astonishing, but it was also the product of leadership, timing, enemy dispersion, cavalry shock, morale, and the willingness of a small force to risk everything. The emotional truth of the story does not need exaggeration. What fascinates me most is the question of honor, because it is never as simple in real history as people want it to be. What did honor actually mean to men like Baldwin and Saladin? Not in poetry, not in polished speeches, in lived experience. For Baldwin, honor may have meant refusing to let illness draw the boundaries of duty. For Saladin, it may have meant joining conquest to legitimacy and sacred obligation. For the knights and soldiers under them, honor was probably much less stable. It may have meant loyalty in one hour, fear in the next, greed in another, then courage again under pressure. That is what I never want to lose when talking about the medieval world. War changes people, but it does not change them into one thing. It magnifies what is already there. Some men become steadier, some become crueler, some simply become tired in a way that no heroic story can capture. The distance between a knight in a manuscript and a knight after battle is the distance between symbol and flesh. And Baldwin understood flesh more brutally than most rulers ever had to. Saladin, in his own way, understood endurance. Their lives crossed at one of those rare points where private suffering and historical consequence become inseparable. If Baldwin had been healthy, perhaps the politics of the kingdom would have unfolded differently. If Saladin had failed to unify Egypt and Syria, perhaps Baldwin's reign would be remembered in a very different light. History is never made by one cause alone. It emerges where many pressures meet inside human choices. By the end of the 12th century, the world shaped by these two men was already shifting into another phase. The Third Crusade brought Richard the Lionheart into the story, and popular memory naturally gravitated towards that larger and more internationally visible conflict. Baldwin receded, Saladin remained central. And yet people keep returning to Baldwin. I do not think that is only because the image is dramatic, a sick king, a lost kingdom, impossible odds. I think it's because Baldwin forces us to confront something uncomfortable and enduring. Human worth and historical force do not always align with strength as the world usually measures strength. Sometimes the failing body carries the strongest will in the room. That does not make suffering noble by itself. Suffering alone proves nothing. What matters is what a person does while carrying it. Baldwin did not choose his disease. He chose to rule. He chose to remain present. He chose to continue acting in a world that had every reason to count him out. That is why he matters. Saladin matters for another reason. He represents the kind of opponent history is often tempted to flatten into a simple enemy. But Saladin was never simple. He was pious, pragmatic, ambitious, and politically gifted. He could be generous in one setting, severe in another. He could lose and then return stronger. That capacity to absorb humiliation, learn from it, and continue was one of the reasons he ultimately prevailed.
Together, Baldwin and Saladin show us something larger than either man alone. They show us an age that was sacred and brutal at the same time, idealistic and calculating, deeply personal in its suffering, and enormous in its consequences. They show us how faith, politics, illness, war, and memory all become entangled until no single story is enough. That, I think, is why this period still holds such power. Not because it gives us clear heroes and villains, but because it refuses to stay simple. Baldwin is not diminished by Saladin's greatness. Saladin is not diminished by Baldwin's courage. In fact, each makes the other more historically real. A dying king is more impressive when the conqueror facing him is truly formidable. A victorious conqueror is more impressive when the ruler he once feared was physically broken and still dangerous. That is what later myth often misses. It turns Baldwin into pure tragedy and Saladin into pure greatness. But the truth is more demanding. Baldwin was great because he kept ruling under conditions of pain, weakness, and faction. Saladin was great because he could survive setback, rebuild, and think beyond revenge. And both of them remind us that history is not a stage for symbols alone. It is made by bodies, by decisions, by roads, heat, water, fear, and the limits of what one person can hold together. That is why I keep coming back to them. Because when the legends fade a little, what remains is not less powerful, it is more. A sick king trying to outlast his own body. A conqueror patient enough to wait for the moment history opened. And between them, a world that would never be the same again.
If we step back now from the battles, the councils, the succession disputes, and the smoke of the siege lines, what remains is not a fairy tale about good and evil. It is something harder than that, and I think more worth remembering. A sick young king inherited a brittle kingdom on the edge of stronger powers. A formidable Muslim ruler built the political and military unity needed to challenge that kingdom seriously. They met across a decade shaped by war, diplomacy, sacred duty, ambition, and exhaustion. One won a stunning battlefield victory, the other won Jerusalem. Both became larger in memory than they were in life, and smaller too, depending on who was doing the remembering. But when I stay close to the sources and close to the physical realities of their world, the noise of legend begins to quiet down. What I hear instead is more human. I hear horses breathing in the cool morning air before a march. I hear armor settling onto tired shoulders. I hear the low murmur of prayer, spoken not as performance, but because men facing battle often reach for words stronger than themselves. I imagine candlelight moving against cold stone, while counsel grows tense. I imagine Saladin, disciplined and watchful, learning from defeat. I imagine Baldwin, increasingly blind and in pain, trying to govern a realm that needed more years from him than his body could possibly give. There is no clean comfort in this story. Baldwin did not save Jerusalem forever. Saladin did not restore it without fear, blood, loss, and all the costs that accompany conquest. Knights were not spotless guardians of virtue, and they were not just brutes in polished mail either. They were men of their time, carrying ideals they often failed to live up to, and sometimes, under terrible pressure, living up to them just enough to change history. That may be the truest thing I can say about honor. It is not perfection, it is not image, it is what remains when fear, ambition, suffering, and self-interest have all had their say, and a person still chooses a duty that may break him. Baldwin chose that more than once. Saladin chose his own version of it too, though on the other side of the line. If you ask me why this story still matters, I would say because it resists simplification. It does not let us sort the past into easy heroes and easy villains. It asks us to look at power and fragility at the same time. It asks us to see that the man most visibly marked with weakness may be the one holding an entire state together,
and that the victorious conqueror may earn respect not because he was gentle, but because he was serious enough to recognize the worth of a serious enemy. That, I think, is why Baldwin and Saladin still command attention. They force us to ask what war actually reveals, not just who wins, but what kind of people emerge under pressure. Not just what kingdoms fall, but how long those kingdoms were being held together by individuals